I'm Alan Wartes, and this is ThinkRadio Presents ThinkBusiness. My guest today is Stephen Kett.
You know, the whole notion of humility, let's just say in the public sphere now, whichever side of the aisle you sing your hymns from, humility is probably the least common quality that you see these days. And is it any surprise then that leadership is in such short supply? I wish I had a happier answer for you there, but...
Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio.
Think Business is made possible by funding from the ICE Lab at Western, supporting innovative business in the rural Southwest.
If you like Think Business, then I know you'll enjoy the other shows in the Think Radio Presents family of podcasts. Think People, a celebration of just how amazing people can be. Think Planet, conversations with thought leaders on important environmental issues. Subscribe to Think Radio Presents on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you get great content. And don't forget to help us spread the word by liking our social media channels and sharing the content we post. We're grateful to have you in the conversation on Think Radio Presents. My guest today is Stephen Kett. He's the founder and CEO of Stephen Kett and Associates, a private consulting and development firm located in Great Falls, Virginia. The company's mission is to provide world-class facilitation, teaching, and leadership development for executive leaders. He holds an MA from Harvard University and has worked with high-potential clients in such diverse industries as healthcare, banking, pharmaceuticals, finance, utilities, and manufacturing. Steve is an excellent teacher, coach, entertaining storyteller, and, as I recently discovered, a well-mannered dinner conversationalist. Steve, thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
You know, we've got a lot to talk about, a lot we can talk about, but I thought we might want to start on the ground floor and really just pick up some definitions. Some people might not actually fully understand what a consultant does, what a coach does, what a leadership development specialist does. Why don't you give us the elevator version?
So the simple version is a consultant consults, and what that means is they share their expertise on any number of topics that their clients are interested in being advised on. And that can include things like new product design. It can include things like strategy or marketing, leadership development, and programs to enhance that. And a coach, a little different. A coach is a person who is also a good listener, like any good consultant would be, but it's someone who is also a wonderful questioner. And by asking questions, much like Socrates used to say, you would get people to come to some answers or self-awareness that, the answers lie within them. It's not you. And a good coach is not someone who tells someone much. It's a good coach is someone who reveals it to them by asking them questions. So questioning skills become paramount in the coaching world. And leadership development, very broad term, obviously. And it is, in simplest terms, it's a field that came about because as corporations were growing and were promoting people, they were finding in large numbers that just because someone is a very good, excellent, even superb individual contributor, that does not mean they necessarily know how to lead people.
Something the military has learned over the decades.
Absolutely right.
Sometimes the hard way.
Absolutely right. And so it is, when I say it's broad, it involves any number of different kinds of teaching and facilitation and coaching skills, and it's something that I think I've really developed a passion for over the years, in part because it's so rewarding to see people sort of grow into their leadership skins, if you will, because they sometimes I think people really do believe the old adage about, leaders are born, not made. And I could not disagree more with that. I think wonderful leaders are made. And another myth is that there's a leader for all seasons. And of course, there are situations in which different kinds of leaders thrive and other kinds of leaders don't do quite as well. So one of the keys, not that you asked, but one of the keys for any leader is all starts with self-awareness and understanding yourself very well. So if you start there, then I think you really do have a chance to blossom into a wonderful leader of people. In a business setting, as you said, a military setting. I don't have experience there, but in any kind of organizational setting. And I just think, without winding on, I do think it's a particular set of skills that is in very great need today in the business world, in the private sector, in the public sector.
Well, we're going to get there. That's one of the things that I really would like to unpack together is the role that leadership plays in the state of society, in good times and bad. But before we do, I kind of want to go back and unpack a couple of things in what you just said. Starting with coaching and the skills that you mentioned being good listening and good questioning. Boy, when you talk about a polarized situation like we find ourselves in today with the political landscape and culture war sort of conflict that has gripped the country, those are two really important skill sets to have. So it made me not want to go rushing by them. Let's go back and talk about that a little bit. What makes, in your mind, a good listener? How do you do that?
Well, it's very hard to fake good listening. First of all, people can tell that you are faking it. And one of the things that is a sure sign is the telltale body language or actual word choice and eye contact, all the basic things that fundamentally convey you really don't care about what they have to say. And it can be very subtle. It doesn't have to be, I don't care what you think. It can be much more sort of minute kind of interactions that are most of which are nonverbal. And so when I said earlier, self-awareness is the start of it, it's being aware of what kind of messages you're sending all the time. Because it's not just the big moments where people are saying, okay, I sense a message is being sent here. It's in all the small moments. And if you're going to lead people or you're going to bring people together, to your question, I think you have really honestly got to care about what they think and communicate that both with your words and with your nonverbal cues.
Well, the common description of listening when it's done poorly is simply waiting for your turn to speak next.
Right.
And that's where it's from what I understand of body language, it's actually really hard to shield your body language from what you're actually thinking. Is that true in your experience, that these are not like tricks and techniques? You're talking about, no, you actually legitimately have to care.
That's exactly
what
right.
The person you're
That's why I started there, Alan, because I think if you don't, again, you really can't fake it. And it's, we've all seen the practiced gestures, from people on, at the dais or behind a podium where they take off their glasses for effect, or they, and when you're communicating with a person, there are the same sorts of affectations that people pick right up on, I believe anyway. And so the best defense against anyone coming away with that reaction is to start with, what's my motive? Is my motive to understand you? Is my motive to listen to you, to learn from you, to understand where you're coming from? If that is my motive, then there's a better chance that I'm, without even opening my mouth, going to let you know that. Hopefully the words then match. But that's why it starts, I think, with authenticity around that. I really do care.
Yeah. Well, so this brings up a question to me. You're talking about things that are not about technique. They're not about a bullet point list of things that you can do today to be a better leader. You invoke words like self-awareness. Well, that's almost a spiritual pursuit in some ways. Developing self-awareness takes a lot of focus, a lot of desire, a lot of time.
A lot of humility.
A lot of humility, correct. And so then my question to you is, do you feel like you're actually, when you undertake leadership development and coaching of these, you call them high potential clients, are you actually in the business of making them better people?
It's not what I would say I set out to do, but I guess in a way, yes, because I think that part of the challenge today when you talked about the fractured society and so on and so forth is that people don't care as much as they should, and they're waiting for their turn to talk. But it's also, there's a tremendous amount of judging of others' views and others' motives for their views that comes in very early in the process. And I think if you could help people to be less judgmental, if you could help people to at least postpone any kind of evaluation of the merits of what they're saying until you've really heard them, then I do think you're making them a better person, because I do think they will understand more of their colleagues, of their families, of their community, their friends, people at their church, wherever it is. It's an interesting question the way you phrased it, but I guess yes, because these are not, tips or techniques, or don't forget to look to one side or the other twice during every 15-minute span.
Yeah.
It's the kind of stuff that is very, very hard to mask and very, very telling without a word.
Well, one of the things that I see when I look at the political landscape, for instance, today, is there seems to be this idea, if we could, we being whichever side of the aisle you happen to be on, if we could only gain control of all of the organs of power and control, it would be possible for us to create a system that works with rules and regulations that we approve of, and the system would solve the problems. And yet, what you're suggesting, and what I think I've observed, is it's a lot more complicated than that. We're talking about a human problem, not a system problem. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. I also think that it's not just in the public sphere. A lot of, moving us back to business for just a moment, a lot of up-and-coming talented managers and senior managers and vice presidents and so on honestly believe somewhere in their heart that when they get to be the CIO, the CFO, the CEO, that it will be different, because now I will be able to tell and control how people behave.
Yeah.
And the reason that will be better than the status quo is because it's me in charge. And
this time the rules will work.
They'll work this time. And I realize that, all of my forebears have gone about this incorrectly, but I won't make those same mistakes. And I think what any executive in a business who's successful over a long career will tell you is that as they move up in an organization, they realize that their power comes from the ability to inspire and to enable and to mobilize the best in the people around them. It's not about incorporating their worldview. And you mentioned about if we could only control the organs of power, so moving back into the world of government, both houses of Congress and the White House, then we can make it happen because we will just simply dictate.
Yeah.
And, of course, that's also a epic level of sort of lack of humility.
Hubris is the word that comes to mind.
Hubris is exactly right.
Yeah.
And people who believe that will never be, in my opinion, great leaders. And I think it was Dwight Eisenhower who famously said, leadership is the art of getting other people to do what you think they should do because they want to do it. Now, that's a little bit of a manipulation by President Eisenhower, but I might amend it by saying, by getting to the right answer, by getting the best inputs from all the people around you. And it may sound a bit off-putting, but not only is it possible, but it's quite frequent that they have better answers than you do or I do. And if you believe that you walk into the room as the smartest or the most experienced or the whatever, and your motive is not to really understand what they could contribute, but rather to dictate your view, that is exactly what happens. And there's
well, and if I may interject there, they're not likely to follow you very far or very long if that's the kind of energy that you bring to the room. Is that true also, that when you come in with that attitude, that's not leadership because, frankly, nobody's going to follow you?
Well, it was I forget the gentleman's first name. He was a Harvard sociologist in the 50s. His last name was Heller. And he talked about the 3 levels of behavior change. The lowest level of behavior change is compliance. The next level up is understanding, and the third level is internalization. And what he meant there was compliance is, in fact, getting someone to do what you would like them to do. Of course, the problem with compliance is there is no shared view of what the problem is or why we should be doing this. It's simply, I work for you, and you can make me do this. And the second that you take my eye off what I do, I'll go back to the way I used to do it because all I'm doing is complying. I'm not following you. The understanding level is I at least accept that there is a problem and we have a shared definition of what that is, and I understand we need to solve it. I don't necessarily buy your solution, but it's more than compliance. And internalization is when you truly have become sort of, or you're, to use the cliche, you're on the same page. And you know when someone has internalized behavioral change when they say things like, well, how else would we do this? Or I think we've always done it this way, haven't we? That's
well, what if we did it this way? Now they're participating.
And Heller's point was you might have to start your leadership journey or your behavior change journey at the compliance level sometimes, but you will never have what you will have is change that starts and stops versus change that sticks. If you want it to stick, people have got to internalize the change. So your comment, Alan, about they're not really following you, they're complying basically. And yes, you can make people do that depending on how the org chart looks in an organization or who's in charge on Capitol Hill or.
And yet, back to my point is that's not leadership.
No.
That's compulsion.
That's exactly right.
And it kind of reinforces the third point that Eisenhower was making, getting people to do what you want them to do. But the third element there was because they want to.
That's right.
And that is not something that can be manufactured. You have to actually go through the process to genuinely create that.
That's right. That's exactly right. And again, I think that the ability to ask questions very effectively with people is part of the secret sauce, if I might say, of great leaders, because they spend a lot less time, folks who haven't ever led think as they move up the ladder, they'll write memos and, send out the announcement that this is going to happen. Those who've been in an organization for any period of time know that where change happens is at the front line, and where people are actually networked in such a way that real work and real change can happen. It's much less about what the memo down from the top office says. So leading people, again, we talk about listening. If questioning skills, if you're going to listen really well, then you've got to have some really good questions that you want to listen to.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, we're not, in my experience, not very good at all at asking questions. We think we are. We think that if there's rising inflection at the end of our statement, that must be a good question. And I've always found that in my coaching work, for example, preparing great questions takes just as much work as preparing a presentation or preparing a speech, or and really great questions do not just occur to us on the fly. They're the kind of things that really take practice, really take skill in designing them, and there are many types of questions, closed-ended or sort of kind of fact-finding kind of questions. What time is it? And those are legitimate questions, and we don't have to have the greatest question in the world to find out what we need to know in that instance. But if you really want to understand how something works, or you want to understand why it's not catching on with a group of people, or you want to understand, you have to be able to come at that issue from a multitude of vectors with different kinds of questions. And that is not, I'm trying to remember I think it was Benjamin Franklin who used to say we have two ears and one mouth, and we should use them proportionately, or something like that. Not quite getting the quote right, but and I think we talk an awful lot and we don't listen as much, and obviously questioning skills and listening skills go hand in hand.
So clearly questions then are vitally important. And you say it takes a lot of work to come up with a good question. What are the rules that you would give somebody, or the guidelines that you would give somebody, how to take the time before a meeting, for instance, to make sure that you've thought through what the key questions really are?
Well, I think a lot of the literature on persuasion suggests that counterintuitive information is terribly persuasive. When people say, "Oh my goodness, I've never thought about it like that before," and rather than telling them that actually what you believe about this is actually not right, it actually works the other way around, that would be one way to try to get them to that insight. Another way is to try to come up with questions that I've always called it reversing polarity, which is that causes them momentarily in their brain to reverse their polarity, to unplug the wires and perhaps to plug them back in new places. So, just to give you a for instance,
please.
If I were, and I am not, a presidential scholar, I might say, I have been studying presidential leadership skills now for 30 years, and I really do believe that I can tell you about what kinds of leadership skills would have been optimal after 9/11 in 2001. And I could go on and tell you and just download or didactically share my research.
Based on your pedigree.
Yeah, based on my research and experience. Or I could say, let me ask you a question. What do you think might have happened if Bill Clinton had been president on 9/11? Now, to answer that question, oftentimes you'll know when you've got a good question because any thoughtful person can't jump back and give you the answer.
They've got to
actually
sit back
have
and
to think, and they have to put the gears in motion.
stare at the ceiling for a minute.
And what they do is they put a Venn diagram in that case together in their head. And they think, okay, well, what leadership skills did Bill Clinton have, in my opinion? And what leadership, the other circle, what leadership skills did post 9/11 leadership require? Where's the overlap? How much of an overlap is there? Okay. All right. I think it might have been a little different in the following 3 ways. Now, what you've done is you've made them make a connection in a very personal way. I think the lights go on, to use the cliche, and they stay on longer when you tell someone the answer or you tell someone your findings or research. They can download it, they can hear it, they can write it down, take notes. But it's almost like they're always studying for the test as opposed to trying to learn. And when they learn, it's a process of self-discovery. And they, well, actually, gee, that question, of course, is a classic hypothetical question. But there are loads of kinds of questions. And I think getting people to realize the different kinds of questions they can ask to get the polarity reversed, and the kinds of questions that really cause folks to take a moment, or maybe more than a moment, to put their answer together. And another kind of question that is often very effective is to try to engage a different part of the brain. So if you ask people to describe or to if we in this department were to adopt this new agile methodology, what does a typical day in that office look like? Now, I'm asking you to describe a visual sensation, not just it would be a lot better, people would get along, it would be more efficient, more productive. I'm asking you to describe a picture. And when you
what
have
it would
to
look like.
What would it look like? What would it look like to be followed by what might that feel like in that environment? And what you're doing is you're engaging a different part of their brain in answering the question rather than, because if you ask a pedestrian question, one the kind that all of us think of on our feet very easily, you get a pedestrian answer. You get the first and often most obvious response. And great leaders, just to bring it back for a second to leadership, they understand that you don't want the lazy thinking. You want their best thinking. And so your job in helping to move that forward is to come up with the highest quality questions you have, whether they be hypothetical, whether they be visual, whatever type there are. And I just feel like that part of leadership about not only great listening, but also, the other half of it, which is great questioning. And again, oftentimes people think, well, I'm a good listener. I would say just as often people say, I know I'm a good questioner. I can ask really good questions. And I think the fact of the matter is very, very gifted and very, very practiced questioners, they can get you to bake a cake without giving you any of the ingredients, and that's a real skill.
Well, and at the end of the day, you feel that the conclusions you reach are yours.
That's right. They own it much more, which is key in the coaching realm, because they have a much greater ownership of the solution. The more that you come in and tell them, I'm a little more experienced than you. I've seen this before. Here's what you should do. First of all, I think retention goes down on that idea. Second of all, ownership goes down, meaning they're not really following. They're sort of taking your word for it that it's a good way to go. And third, heaven forfend, they may often have a better solution than you do, no matter how experienced you are. But again, you've got to want, your motive has to be, I genuinely care what you think.
And I genuinely want the best outcome here, not just the one that I've already decided upon.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that, you know, Jim Collins in Built to Last, or maybe it was Good to Great, I can't remember, one of his first 2 books, he talks about level 5 leadership, and one of the qualities there, which everybody's heard of course, is humility, that great leaders are really humble. And part of that humility comes from the willingness to understand that other people can have better, more creative, more original solutions than you can. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean you're not required. It doesn't mean that you're not a good leader. In fact, you're all the much more of a better leader because you're getting the best out of the team or getting the best out of that person individually or both. And so I've always believed that questioning skills are one of the most overlooked parts of great leadership. Self-awareness is that I believe I'm very good at these 2 things or these 3 things, but I am not at all embarrassed about asking for help in these other 4 things. And when I ask you for your input with some very high-quality questions, that is more likely to result, as you just said, in a much better outcome, rather than, you know, I've seen this before, I know this is what we should do.
Just get on board with my plan and let's go.
Yeah, let's get going.
So a lot of the people listening to this broadcast are not high-level executives. They're not in a position really to hire coaches, perhaps. They're mid-level. Maybe they're even entrepreneurs, and they've got 4 employees. What advice do you have for those people who really are at that level? How do they go about acquiring the kind of knowledge that you impart to your clients?
Well, I've always been a big believer that there is a tremendous amount of wisdom to be found in the great books. And therefore, by the way, you'll notice I'm not saying in the business section. That usually is not the place, in my opinion, to find them. So the 1-minute manager and, you know, the Zap solution and all of that stuff.
And why not?
Well, because if great leadership were as simple as the 2-minute leader or the 5-minute, you know, whatever, we would have a lot more. We would have an overabundance, a superabundance of wonderful leaders. And I think
because people want to be good leaders.
That's exactly right. They want to be good leaders, but they don't, you know, so it's not easy. It's a lot more, as you said a moment ago, it's a lot more complicated than that. And it takes a lifetime of work to do it. So those entrepreneurs and those mid-level folks you were mentioning, I think, first of all, one of the first things I would tell someone is just start noticing how much of the time you spend with your team or another person in your very small startup organization, do you spend talking versus listening? Just start there. Just notice it. And I'm not trying to make them, you know, so, you know, wrapped around the axle they can't perform their work. But I think that's the baby first step in self-awareness. And a lot of people are completely taken aback when they do that first sort of assessment. It's like, wow, I do talk a lot. And I think I'm really listening really carefully and so on and so forth. But when I actually, you know, keep track of it, it's not so much. The second thing that I think is really important for folks who, you know, they're not hiring coaches or they don't have that capability, or small organizations, is to, you know, with great humility, ask others about what they do. When am I at my best? When am I at my worst? What examples do you have for me? And you've got to have a relationship of trust to do that. People won't share that information, again, unless they believe you that you care about it. And it's fascinating. I used to do an exercise that came out of the University of Michigan called Reflected Best Self, and the lead author was a woman by the name of Gretchen Spreitzer. And this exercise, because so much of our feedback in organizations is the, Alan, you've really done a good job this quarter, and I really appreciate this, and this. But, and most all of us really aren't listening until the but, because we know that the qualifying information is coming next.
Exactly.
The reflected best self was about there's no but. And I want you to choose 20 people that you know, or whatever, 15. They don't have to be just colleagues. They could be, people in your neighborhood. They could be people in your church or in your, orchestra you play in or whatever. And ask them to take a minute to write a paragraph and to answer, no more than a paragraph, to answer the question, when am I at my best? No but. No qualifiers. Tell me. And what was fascinating about doing that exercise for years was and it was, confidential. You'd collect it. And, I guess the first thing is, when was the last time any of us has just received unvarnished, positive feedback? Almost never.
Right.
Almost never. But there are a couple of occasions on which we do. There's actually, I believe, a cultural bias against just sharing positive information, but we can come back to that. But there are a couple of occasions when we do get unvarnished. One is when we retire, and that's when it's, largely useless. And then the other time is when we die. And so people come up and deliver eulogies about
totally useless.
Totally useless then. So we're good in those occasions. But, if we thought about would it be useful like when you're actually trying to grow your organization? And so first is I do think there's a bit of a bias against sharing just positive information.
And where do you think that comes from?
I think that comes from our HR systems. And legal, issues around we've got to have documentation that only is a balanced report so that if we need to take action, we've got a paper trail and so on and so forth. And I don't mean to be simplistic about it, nor am I dismissive of my HR colleagues and friends. They've got a very tough job and legal counsel and so on that's telling them what they need to do for legal purposes. But the other thing is that people would receive this feedback and people would remember things about them from 20 years ago, from 25 years ago, and they'd remember incredibly small things. I remember when
you were at your best.
You were at your best when there was a person who was obviously lost in the lobby and you were, the CEO of the organization, and you didn't, expect that the information desk would take care of it. You didn't just say, are you lost? Well, you could go to the information desk. You actually asked them and took them yourself to where they needed to go. People are watching great leaders, and they're watching the small stuff. And it's important to know that, because what that means is you've got to be authentic in your leadership from top to bottom. It can't be, look, I'm about to make a big decision. I need to be a good leader on this one big decision.
Yeah.
It is either you're continuous and whole person or it isn't.
Well, that reminds you of advice that you read about a good marriage, that, if you want to have a good sex life, that starts with doing the dishes at breakfast time, and then following through all day long with all of those small, maybe we should stop calling them small.
Right. That's right.
All of those authentic moments where you're revealing who you really are.
That's right. You're revealing, despite your best efforts maybe to hide it.
Yeah.
You're letting it show.
Yeah. I'm the CEO of this company. I can't be seen to be soft or sentimental or any of those things. It's actually the opposite, which brings us back to a point that I made early on, and that is, aren't we really talking about just being a better human being? And then some of this stuff follows along behind.
Well, I agree with that. I do. But I also think it's doing it inside of an organizational context, or doing it. So it's being a better human being, but it's also you are a manager or vice president or CEO of a business, whatever size. So that's number one. And number two is, I think part of the genesis of leadership development was that, the realization that telling people you really, if you're going to be an effective leader, you need to be a better person is really not terribly helpful.
Well, that's a little bit vague.
Yeah, it's it's like, okay, I believe you. Now what do I do?
Yeah.
And so I've always thought that if you can make it as specific, listening skills,
Yes.
questioning skills,
Yes.
authenticity, don't behave like you're hoping someone's watching. Behave like you behave. And people are noticing, but you don't have to worry about that. Just that'll take care of itself. And that reflected best self exercise was really so eye-opening for so many people, because I guess the last thing I'd say about it, oftentimes they were perceived as being at their best at something they did not think they were very good at. So it's not just, I'm a figure skater and I'm a mathematician and I'm darn good at it. I've had people go through that, and someone once received feedback. And by the way, they received it from 4 people who did not know each other, saying, "You're really at your best in delivering eulogies at funerals." And this person was like, "I hate doing eulogies at funerals." And the fact was, as we talked that through, it was because I think that person really came across as deeply authentic and in the moment.
But cared.
And it's hard to fake. I know I've repeated myself twice on that now, but it's very hard to fake that. I just think, just in general, I don't care whether it's younger people or more experienced people. I just think we are wired to look for those indicators of body language and so on, patterns. I think doing one great thing once and going, well, I definitely, did a great. People want to see consistency.
Yeah,
they want to see the pattern.
What do you have for me today?
Yeah, and again, if you're trying to be self-conscious about, if I do this one good thing, or I guess I should let that infraction go. I really think it's terrible, but I'm going to let it go this one time. You won't let it go the next time. You won't let it go, and that's the pattern. And people pick up on the pattern.
Well, we're almost out of time, but and I apologize in advance because I'm about to ask you a very unfair question, given the limited amount of time we have left. But from where you work and with whom you work, are you able to say that you see hopeful signs that this kind of leadership that you're talking about is becoming more the norm? Is it becoming easier to find those leaders in the world that you travel in?
The honest answer is, I don't think so. I don't think so. And, we could have another conversation about why that is. But I think that there's so many myths about leadership that are out there about, you alluded a few minutes ago, Alan, to, I can't appear to be weak, or I can't appear to be vulnerable, or those kinds of things. And if you combine that with some of the incredibly short-term focus in the publicly traded arena, then, the reality is that the board is going to expect you to produce results. And you said, what can you do for me today? Of course, for Wall Street analysts, it's what did you do for me yesterday? It's already old, and so on and so forth. And so I think there are several factors that drive these myths to become realities in people's heads. And, the whole notion of humility, let's just say in the public sphere now, whichever side of the aisle you sing your hymns from, humility is probably the least common quality that you see these days. And is it any surprise then that leadership is in such short supply? I wish I had a happier answer for you there, but that's the honest one.
On that note, all I can say is I'm really sorry that we're out of time, because I think we could go down that trail and talk more about why leadership is in short supply and the consequence that it has had for our nation. But that'll be for another time.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Steve, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
Thanks for watching. Join us next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think Business.